The Galactic Military Institute stood as a monument to order and precision on the moon of Kepler 442b. Its crystalline towers stretched toward the purple-tinted sky, housing the brightest military minds from across 47 different species. For 300 years, the Institute had trained officers who would go on to lead fleets, plan campaigns, and shape the destiny of the galaxy. Today, however, something unprecedented was about to happen. Admiral ZYX, then of the Altarian High Command, stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the transport shuttle descend through the artificial atmosphere. His 6 eyes tracked the vessel with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Inside that shuttle was humanity's contribution to the Institute's guest lecturer program. A species so young they had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, yet had somehow earned a reputation that made even veteran commanders pause. The shuttle touched down with mechanical precision on landing Bay 7. ZYX then Zaid, a nervous Centaurian named Veltar, approached with a data tablet clutched in his 4-fingered hands. "Sir, the human has arrived." Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chun, Terran Colonial Marines, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. Veltar's voice carried the typical uncertainty that most species felt when dealing with humans. His service record is extensive. ZYX then turned from the window, his primary eyes focusing on the tablet, while his secondary ones continued monitoring the landing bay. Define extensive, Veltar. 43 combat deployments across 12 different planetary environments. Veteran of the Rigel Uprising, the Siege of New Singapore, and the Proxima Incident. Veltar's voice dropped on the last 2 words. Everyone in the galaxy knew about Proxima. The Admiral's mandibles clicked together, the Altarian equivalent of raising an eyebrow. The Proxima Incident had been a disaster that should have resulted in total human defeat. A single human colony had faced an overwhelming Kethmoran invasion force. By all tactical calculations, it should have fallen within hours. Instead, the humans had not only held their ground but had somehow turned a defensive action into a counteroffensive that shattered the Kethmoran fleet. And he was there? ZYX then asked. According to his file, he led the ground assault that captured the Kethmoran command ship. Sir, there's something else. Veltar hesitated. The War Department has classified his lecture as a live-fire exercise. This caused all 6 of the Admiral's eyes to focus sharply on his aide. Live-fire exercises meant real weapons, real ammunition, real danger. The Institute had never conducted such a thing during a guest lecture. The insurance alone would be astronomical. On whose authority? Fleet Admiral Torquan himself signed the authorization. The memo simply states that traditional lecture methods may prove inadequate for demonstrating human tactical doctrine. ZYX then's mandibles clicked again, this time in what humans might recognize as nervous laughter. Fleet Admiral Torquan was a legend, a Saurian whose tactical brilliance had ended 3 separate galactic conflicts. If he thought a human required live ammunition to make his point, then perhaps the Institute's faculty was about to learn something they weren't prepared for. Meanwhile, in Landing Bay 7, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chin stepped off the shuttle and immediately began assessing his surroundings with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. The bay was clean, organized, and completely sterile, typical of military installations run by species that had evolved past the need for chaos. Chin was not a particularly imposing figure by human standards. Standing just under 6 feet tall with graying hair at his temples, he looked more like a tired professor than a legendary warrior. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, but showed the subtle signs of someone who spent more time in combat fatigues than formal wear. What marked him as different was his eyes, pale gray and constantly moving, cataloging exits, cover positions, and potential threats with the automatic efficiency of a man who had learned that survival meant never stopping your threat assessment. A delegation approached him across the polished floor of the landing bay. Leading them was a tall, elegant Valdorian with the flowing robes and ceremonial staff that marked him as a member of the Institute's academic council. Behind him walked a diverse group representing the major spacefaring species. A crystalline Xerian whose body reflected the bay's lighting in prismatic patterns, a massive Corvani whose thick hide showed the ritual scarification of a warrior scholar, and several others. Gunnery Sergeant Chun, the Valdorian said in heavily accented Standard Galactic, his translator device giving his words a slight mechanical undertone. I am Professor Nal Veth, head of Advanced Tactical Studies. We welcome you to the Institute. Chun snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. Thank you, Professor. I'm honored to be here. The formalities seemed to relax the delegation slightly. Like most galactic species, they appreciated protocol and proper procedure. What they didn't realize was that Chin's respect for protocol came from a very different place than theirs. Where they saw order as civilization, he saw it as a tool for keeping chaos at bay long enough to accomplish the mission. Your reputation precedes you. Professor Aelveth continued as they began walking toward the Institute's main complex. We understand that human military doctrine differs significantly from established galactic norms. That's one way to put it, Chin replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had sat through enough briefings to know when he was being politely told that everyone thought his people were insane. The Xerian delegate, whose crystalline form chimed softly as he moved, spoke up. We have studied the reports from Proxima, of course. Most fascinating. Though I confess, many of your tactical decisions seem to violate basic principles of military science. Chin's smile became slightly more genuine. Professor? Designation, Quartz 79, Instructor of Strategic Analysis. Professor Quartz, with respect, your basic principles of military science assume that everyone follows the same basic principles. Sometimes the best way to win is to do something so stupid that the enemy can't predict it because no sane person would try it. This caused a ripple of what might have been laughter from some of the delegation, though it was hard to tell with species that expressed amusement through color changes, harmonic frequencies, and chemical releases rather than sound. As they walked through the corridors of the Institute, Chin observed the other students and faculty they passed. The halls were filled with beings from dozens of worlds, all wearing the crisp uniforms of their respective services. They moved with the confident precision of professional military officers, their conversations focused on tactics, logistics, and strategy. It was impressive in its organization and scope. It was also exactly the kind of thinking that had nearly gotten humanity wiped out in its first contact wars. Your lecture is scheduled for tomorrow morning, Professor Inaelveth explained as they entered a transport tube that would carry them to the guest quarters. We have prepared our largest auditorium. Word of your visit has spread, and we expect nearly the entire student body to attend. How many students is that? Chin asked. Approximately 1,200, representing 38 different species and military traditions. Chin nodded thoughtfully. 1,200 of the galaxy's brightest military minds, all trained in conventional tactics, all expecting to see the human oddity explain how his backwards people had somehow stumbled into military success. They were about to get a very different education than they expected. Professor, I understand this has been classified as a live-fire exercise. The delegation exchanged glances. Professor Naelveth cleared his throat, a sound his translator rendered as a complex harmonic sequence. Yes, well, Fleet Admiral Torquan felt that a traditional lecture might not adequately convey the unique aspects of human tactical thinking. Proper safety protocols will be in place, of course. Of course, Chin agreed. He had read Torquan's service record during the flight. The Saurian was brilliant, methodical, and had never lost a campaign. He was also known for his ability to recognize and adapt to new tactical concepts faster than almost anyone in the galaxy. If Torquan wanted a live-fire exercise, it meant he suspected that human military doctrine couldn't be taught through theory alone. The transport tube came to a smooth stop, and they emerged into a residential section of the Institute. The guest quarters were spacious and comfortable, designed to accommodate the widely varying physiological needs of different species. Chin's room included a standard gravitational field generator, atmospheric controls, and even a small kitchen stocked with human-compatible food. We hope you will find everything satisfactory, Professor Aelveth said. If you require anything for tomorrow's presentation, just one thing, Chin interrupted. I'll need a detailed schematic of the auditorium and surrounding areas. Also, I assume the live-fire authorization extends to the use of standard human military equipment. Within reason, yes. What did you have in mind? Chin's smile returned, and This time it carried a hint of something that made several of the delegation take an unconscious step backward. Nothing too complicated, just enough to make sure everyone understands the lesson. After the delegation left, Chen unpacked his gear with the same methodical care he had used in 100 different barracks across the galaxy. His equipment included more than just lecture materials. The authorization for a live-fire exercise had come with permission to bring standard combat gear, and Chun had interpreted standard rather broadly. As he arranged his equipment, he thought about tomorrow's audience. 1,200 military officers who had been trained to think in terms of force multipliers, supply lines, and tactical doctrine. They understood war as a chess game played with ships and soldiers, where victory went to the side that could calculate the most variables and execute their plans with the greatest precision. They were about to learn that sometimes war wasn't a chess game. Sometimes it was a bar fight in an alley, where the winner was whoever was willing to break the most rules and hit the hardest when it mattered most. Chen finished his preparations and settled down to review the Institute's layout one more time. Tomorrow would either be the most educational experience in the galaxy's military history, or it would be the incident that got humanity banned from the Institute permanently. Knowing his people, it would probably be both. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as 1,200 of the galaxy's finest military minds filed into their seats. The amphitheater was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the diverse physical requirements of dozens of species. Atmospheric zones allowed methane breathers to sit comfortably next to oxygen-dependent life forms, while gravitational fields could be adjusted for species ranging from the massive Corvani to the delicate, low-gravity Etherians. In the front rows sat the Institute's most distinguished faculty and visiting dignitaries. Admiral ZYX then occupied a place of honor, his 6 eyes scanning the crowd with professional interest. Beside him, Fleet Admiral Torquan had arrived unexpectedly that morning, his massive saurian frame requiring a specially reinforced chair. The old reptilian's presence had sent ripples of excitement through the student body. Legends didn't usually attend guest lectures. Professor Nalveth stepped up to the central podium, his ceremonial robes flowing around him as he activated the auditorium's translation systems. Distinguished colleagues and students, today we have the rare privilege of learning from a representative of humanity's military forces. Our guest has agreed to demonstrate the tactical principles that have made human forces notably effective despite their recent emergence onto the galactic stage. The phrase notably effective drew scattered chuckles from the audience. Everyone knew the real story. Humanity had stumbled into galactic politics like a drunk cadet into a formal reception, loud, unpredictable, and somehow still standing when the dust settled. Please welcome Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chun, Terran Colonial Marines. The applause was polite as Chun emerged from the side entrance. He walked to the podium with the measured stride of someone who had crossed 1,000 battlefields, carrying a single equipment case, and wearing what appeared to be a modified version of his dress uniform. The modifications were subtle but noticeable to trained eyes: reinforced joints, integrated armor plating, and what looked suspiciously like weapon hardpoints. Chin set down his case and looked out over the sea of faces, scales, chitinous plates, and crystalline forms that comprised his audience. For a moment, the auditorium fell completely silent. Before we begin, Chin said, his voice carrying easily through the space without amplification, I want to thank you all for this opportunity. When I was a kid growing up on New Harmony, I never imagined I'd be standing in front of the galaxy's best and brightest, talking about the art of war. He paused, his pale gray eyes scanning the crowd with the systematic attention of a sniper acquiring targets. I also want to apologize in advance for what's about to happen. The confused murmur that followed this statement was cut short as Chin opened his equipment case. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was what appeared to be a standard human combat helmet, a tactical display unit, and several objects that made the security officers in the audience sit up straighter. Today's lesson is about the fundamental difference between human military doctrine and what the rest of the galaxy considers standard practice. Chun lifted the helmet from the case and placed it on his head. The moment it activated, holographic displays sprang to life around the auditorium, showing detailed schematics of the building they were sitting in. Most of you learn tactics from species that have been fighting wars for thousands of years. You understand concepts like force projection, supply line management, and tactical superiority. These are good concepts. They work. They've won wars and saved lives across hundreds of worlds. The holographic display shifted, showing historical battle formations from various galactic conflicts. The audience recognized famous victories from their own species' histories, elegant maneuvers that had become textbook examples of military brilliance. The problem is that these concepts assume your enemy is rational. They assume that both sides are playing by the same rules, with the same goals, and the same understanding of acceptable losses. Chen's voice took on a harder edge. Humans don't make those assumptions. He reached into the case again and pulled out what looked like a standard-issue sidearm. Several security officers tensed, but the weapon remained pointed at the floor. 6 years ago, I was part of a reconnaissance team on Kepler for 38C. Our mission was to gather intelligence on Keth Moran defensive positions. Standard stuff. Get in, collect data, get out without being detected. Textbook recon. The holographic display changed to show an aerial view of a heavily fortified Keth Moran installation. The defensive positions were layered and overlapping, a masterpiece of military engineering that would have impressed any of the Institute's instructors. My team consisted of 12 Marines. We were facing an entrenched enemy force of approximately 3,000, with air support, artillery, and enough firepower to level a small city. By every tactical manual in the galaxy, our mission parameters were clear: observe and report. Do not engage. Chen smiled that cold smile that had made the delegation nervous the day before. We destroyed the entire installation. The auditorium erupted in confused chatter. Professor Nalveth leaned forward in his seat, his translator working overtime to keep up with the rapid-fire questions from the faculty. "That's impossible," called out a Centaurian instructor from the middle section. 12 soldiers cannot defeat 3,000, regardless of training or equipment. "You're absolutely right," Chen agreed. 12 soldiers can't defeat 3,000. But 12 humans who have stopped thinking like soldiers can do things that would make your tactical computers crash trying to calculate the odds. He touched a control on his tactical display, and the holographic battlefield changed. Red icons representing the Keth Moran forces began moving in patterns that made several of the military instructors nod approvingly. Textbook defensive positioning. The Keth Moran were brilliant. Their commander, a veteran named Esikithar, had studied human tactics extensively. He knew we were coming. He knew our capabilities. He had planned for every possible scenario that a rational military force might attempt. Blue icons representing Chen's team appeared on the display, moving through the terrain in what looked like standard infiltration patterns. What he hadn't planned for was that we wouldn't try to be a military force at all. The blue icons suddenly scattered in what appeared to be complete chaos. Half the audience gasped as they watched the human positions spread across impossible terrain, splitting into groups that were too small to be effective, taking positions that violated basic tactical doctrine. The first thing we did was throw away the mission. Intelligence gathering became secondary to target elimination. This freed us from the constraints of operational security and stealth protocols. A Corvani general in the front row stood up abruptly. "That's insane. You compromised your primary objective for a target you couldn't possibly achieve." Chen nodded. "Exactly. And because it was insane, they didn't see it coming." The holographic display showed the beginning of the assault. The scattered blue icons began moving in coordinated patterns that made no sense from a conventional tactical standpoint. The second thing we did was forget about acceptable losses. Every member of my team went into that fight assuming they were going to die. This eliminated fear, hesitation, and the need to maintain escape routes or safe positions. Admiral Zyx then's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Altarian equivalent of stammering. But, military units cannot function without survival protocols. Basic biology demands self-preservation. Human biology is weird, Chen said simply. We can override self-preservation when we believe the mission is more important than our individual survival. It's not rational, but it's effective. The holographic battle continued, showing the human team's assault on the Keth Moran positions. What had started as a reconnaissance mission had become something that looked more like a natural disaster than a military operation. The blue icons moved through defensive positions that should have been impregnable, striking from directions that violating basic tactical principles. The third thing we did was embrace chaos. Instead of trying to impose order on the battlefield, we became part of the chaos. We used the enemy's confusion and our own unpredictability as weapons. Fleet Admiral Torquan had been silent throughout the presentation, but now he leaned forward with intense interest. His ancient Saurian eyes focused on the display with the attention of someone who had spent centuries studying the art of war. "Show us the details," he rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets across the galaxy. Chun touched another control, and the display zoomed in on specific moments of the battle. What the audience saw defied everything they thought they knew about military operations. Corporal Martinez here decided that the heavily fortified command bunker was too difficult to assault directly, so he buried himself in a supply convoy and detonated a thermite charge when he reached the command level. Private Johnson concluded that the automated defense turrets were too well programmed to confuse, so she climbed on top of one and rode it like a mechanical bull while shooting its operators. The holographic figures moved through scenarios that seemed to come from fever dreams rather than military manuals. Each action taken by the human team violated some fundamental principle of warfare, yet the cumulative effect was devastating. Sergeant Williams found that the Kethmoran had prepared for every possible assault route except straight up the middle with no cover whatsoever, so that's exactly what she did. She sprinted across 200 meters of open ground while enemy gunfire chewed up everything around her, screaming human profanity that apparently confused the Kethmoran enough to throw off their targeting. A crystalline Xerian instructor chimed in harmonic confusion. "These tactics are completely random. There's no underlying strategic principle." "That's where you're wrong," Chen replied, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a crucial lesson. "There is a strategic principle, but it's one that most species can't implement because their biology won't let them." He gestured to the holographic battlefield, where the blue icons continued their impossible assault. "The strategic principle is adaptive chaos. Humans are uniquely capable of abandoning predetermined plans and creating new solutions in real time based on immediate battlefield conditions. We don't just adapt to changing circumstances. We deliberately create changing circumstances to force our enemies to adapt faster than their decision-making systems can handle." The auditorium had fallen completely silent. 1,200 of the galaxy's finest military minds were watching a tactical doctrine that shouldn't work, deployed by soldiers who shouldn't survive, achieving results that shouldn't be possible. The Kethmoran commander, Essi Kithar, was a brilliant tactician. He had contingency plans for his contingency plans. But every plan he had was based on the assumption that his enemy would act rationally. When faced with an enemy that deliberately chose irrational actions, his entire decision-making framework collapsed. Chun touched the display one final time, showing the conclusion of the battle. The Kethmoran installation, which should have been impregnable, lay in ruins. Of the 3,000 defenders, none had survived. Of the 12 human marines, 3 had died, and 5 were seriously wounded. The mission was classified as a complete success. We eliminated a major enemy stronghold, captured valuable intelligence, and demonstrated that human forces could achieve strategic objectives that other species considered impossible. Fleet Admiral Torquan stood slowly, his massive frame dominating the front of the auditorium. "Gunnery Sergeant Chun, what you've described isn't tactics. It's controlled insanity." Chun met the ancient Saurian's gaze without flinching. "With respect, sir, you're absolutely right. The question is, does controlled insanity win wars?" The silence that followed this exchange was broken by the soft sound of Professor Inielveth clearing his throat. "This is all very interesting in theory, Sergeant, but surely you don't expect us to simply take your word for these extraordinary claims?" Chin's smile returned, and for the first time since entering the auditorium, it reached his eyes. "Professor, remember when I mentioned this was classified as a live-fire exercise?" The emergency lighting had been activated throughout the Institute, bathing the corridors in a pulsing red glow that made everything look like the inside of a beating heart. Admiral ZYX then stood in the emergency command center. All 6 of his eyes focused on the tactical displays that showed the impossible situation unfolding in his facility. "Report," he ordered, his voice tight with controlled panic. Commander Veltar's 4 hands danced across multiple control panels as he tried to make sense of the sensor readings. "Sir, at exactly 1400 hours, all security systems in Section 7 went offline simultaneously. Emergency lockdown protocols engaged automatically, sealing the area. We lost contact with security teams Alpha through Delta, and—" He paused, his voice becoming even more strained. "Sir, something is moving through the ventilation systems. Something? The sensors detect a single human life sign, but it's moving in patterns that should be impossible. It's traversed vertical shafts without using access ladders, bypassed motion detectors that should have triggered automatically, and somehow accessed maintenance areas that require security clearance levels it doesn't possess." Admiral ZYX then's mandibles clicked in rapid succession as he processed this information. When they had agreed to Chen's live-fire exercise, they had expected a controlled demonstration in the auditorium. They had not expected the human to treat the entire institute as his personal training ground. "What about the students and faculty in the auditorium?" "Still secure, sir. The lockdown protocols sealed that section as well." However, Veltar's voice trailed off as he stared at his displays. "Sir, I'm reading weapons fire in Section 7. Multiple signatures consistent with human small arms. Who is he shooting at?" "That's just it, sir. There's no one else in that section." All personnel were evacuated when the lockdown began. Back in the auditorium, the 1,200 military minds that comprised the Institute's finest were getting a very different education than they had expected. The holographic displays that Chun had activated were now showing real-time feeds from the Institute's security cameras, and what they were watching defied every principle of military science they had ever learned. Chun moved through the corridors like a force of nature contained in human form. His borrowed combat gear, officially requisitioned as demonstration materials, allowed him to interface with the Institute's systems in ways that the architects had never intended. What the audience was seeing was human military doctrine in its purest form, the complete abandonment of conventional tactics in favor of adaptive chaos. As you can observe, Chen's voice came through the auditorium speakers, apparently transmitted from wherever he was in the facility. "The first principle of human combat doctrine is environmental exploitation. Most species design their military installations to channel enemy movement into predetermined kill zones. Humans prefer to ignore the channels entirely." The camera feeds showed Chun moving through spaces that weren't designed for transit, crawling through maintenance shafts, rappelling down elevator wells, and, at one point, simply punching through a wall that was apparently thinner than the building's architects had intended. Professor Nalveth stood at his podium, gripping its edges with enough force to leave marks in the metal. "This is madness. He's treating a civilian educational facility like an active battlefield." "Exactly," rumbled Fleet Admiral Torquan, who seemed to be the only person in the auditorium enjoying the situation. "Continue, Sergeant. Show them how chaos becomes strategy." Chen's response came as a series of small explosions echoed through the building. The camera feeds showed him deploying what appeared to be standard human breaching charges to open new pathways through the Institute's carefully planned architecture. "The second principle is rapid environmental modification. If the terrain doesn't suit your tactical needs, change the terrain. Most species consider this a last resort. Humans consider it standard operating procedure." A Corvani colonel in the third row stood up abruptly. "He's destroying the facility. This has gone far beyond any reasonable demonstration." "Has it?" asked Fleet Admiral Torquan, his ancient eyes gleaming with something that might have been amusement. "Sergeant Chun, perhaps you could explain your objective to the class?" "Certainly, sir." Chen's voice remained calm and professional despite the sounds of combat echoing in the background. "My mission parameters are simple. Demonstrate human tactical doctrine through practical application. Primary objective: penetrate Institute security and reach the Central Command facility. Secondary objective: do so while providing educational commentary for observing students." The camera feeds showed Chen approaching a heavily secured checkpoint that had been designed to stop anything short of a full military assault. 3 separate defensive systems covered the approach: automated turrets, energy barriers, and a sophisticated sensor array that could detect threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Standard galactic military doctrine would approach this obstacle through one of several established methods: overwhelming firepower, technological superiority, or tactical misdirection. Humans prefer a fourth option: complete disregard for the rules that define the obstacle in the first place. Instead of approaching the checkpoint directly, Chun disappeared from view. For several moments, the cameras showed only empty corridors while the sounds of his movement echoed through the facility's speaker systems. "Where did he go?" asked a Centaurian instructor. The answer came in the form of Chun dropping through the ceiling directly behind the defensive checkpoint. He had somehow accessed the maintenance levels above the secured area and simply bypassed the entire defensive system by approaching from a direction that the designers had considered physically impossible. The third principle of human tactics is dimensional thinking. Most species plan their defenses in 2 dimensions, occasionally extending to basic 3-dimensional coverage. Humans routinely operate in 4 dimensions by treating time as a navigational coordinate. Admiral ZYX then's voice crackled over the auditorium's communication system from the emergency command center. "What does that mean? How can you treat time as navigation?" "Simple, Admiral. Instead of planning to be in the right place at the right time, plan to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But make sure that wrong becomes right through your actions." Chen's explanation was accompanied by the sound of security doors being forcibly opened. "I'm not trying to avoid your defensive systems. I'm trying to reach them before they're fully active, after they've reset from their last cycle, or while they're focused on threats from directions that made sense 30 seconds ago, but don't make sense now." The camera feeds showed him moving through the Institute's Central Command section with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent his entire adult life turning impossible situations into merely improbable ones. Emergency lights strobed around him as security systems tried to track and respond to a threat that wasn't behaving according to their programming. Professor Nalveth had abandoned his podium and was pacing back and forth at the front of the auditorium. "This is insane. Military doctrine cannot be based on pure improvisation, can't it?" Chen's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Professor, what's the difference between improvisation and adaptation?" "Improvisation is random. Adaptation is responsive to specific stimuli." "Then, explain this." The holographic displays shifted to show a tactical overview of Chen's movement through the facility. What had seemed like random chaos from the individual camera feeds became something else entirely when viewed from above. His path through the Institute formed a complex pattern that gradually became recognizable to the trained military minds watching. "He's not improvising," whispered a Zirian tactical instructor, her crystalline form chiming in harmonic realization. "He's implementing a predetermined strategy that accounts for variables we haven't even considered." Fleet Admiral Torquan stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the front of the auditorium. "Sergeant Chun, show them the pattern." The holographic display zoomed out further, revealing the full scope of Chen's movement through the facility. Every seemingly random detour, every apparently impossible route, every action that had violated conventional tactical wisdom was part of a larger design that was only now becoming visible. "Human military doctrine isn't based on chaos," Chen explained as the pattern completed itself on the display. "It's based on operating within multiple probability frameworks simultaneously. While most species plan for the most likely outcome, humans plan for 17 different outcomes and then implement whichever plan becomes possible based on real-time conditions." The audience watched in stunned silence as the tactical display showed how Chen's route had systematically disabled every major security system in the Institute, gathered intelligence on the facility's defensive capabilities, and created multiple fallback positions that could be activated if his primary mission failed. "Every action I've taken serves multiple purposes. Breaking through that wall didn't just create a new transit route. It also tested the structural integrity of the building, provided noise cover for other movements, and demonstrated to your security forces that their defensive assumptions were incomplete." Admiral Zoyexton's voice came through the speakers again, this time with a note of professional respect that hadn't been there before. "Sergeant, Your approach appears to rely heavily on real-time decision-making. How do you maintain unit cohesion when your tactics are so fluid? That's the fourth principle, Admiral, distributed command authority. Most galactic military forces use hierarchical command structures because they assume that coordination requires central planning. Humans discovered that coordination can emerge from shared objectives even when individual actions appear unrelated. The camera feeds showed Chen reaching the Institute's central command facility. The blast doors that protected the heart of the institution were designed to withstand direct bombardment from ship-based weapons. They were also completely irrelevant to Chen's mission. Instead of attempting to breach the doors, he activated a portable communication device and patched into the facility's internal systems. Admiral ZYX then, "This is Gunnery Sergeant Chun. Permission to enter the command center?" There was a long pause before the Admiral's reply came through the speakers. "Sergeant, you've spent the last hour systematically dismantling our security systems. Why are you asking permission now?" "Because the mission is complete, sir. I've demonstrated that human tactical doctrine can overcome defensive systems designed by the galaxy's finest military minds. Now I'd like to demonstrate that humans are also capable of recognizing when further action would serve no tactical purpose." The blast doors cycled open with a hiss of equalizing atmosphere. Chen walked through them with the same calm professionalism he had maintained throughout the entire exercise. In the auditorium, 1,200 military minds sat in stunned silence as they processed what they had witnessed. The holographic displays showed the complete tactical overview of Chen's operation, a masterpiece of adaptive planning that had turned a peaceful educational facility into a laboratory for demonstrating the principles that had made humanity a force to be reckoned with across the galaxy. Fleet Admiral Torquan began to applaud, the slow, deliberate clapping of someone who recognized genuine mastery when he saw it. One by one, the rest of the auditorium joined him until the entire space echoed with the appreciation of professionals acknowledging something they had never seen before. Chen's voice came through the speakers one last time, calm and matter-of-fact as if he had just finished a routine training exercise rather than revolutionizing galactic military theory. "Class dismissed. Same time tomorrow for questions and practical applications." The emergency lighting shut off, returning the auditorium to normal illumination. In the sudden quiet that followed, Professor Nalveth realized that military education at the Institute would never be quite the same again. Outside, the first transport shuttles were already landing, carrying representatives from every major military force in the galaxy. Word of what had happened at the Institute was spreading through official channels with the speed that only truly significant events could achieve. Humanity's reputation as a military power was about to undergo a dramatic revision. The Institute's main conference hall had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate the unprecedented gathering of military leaders that had descended upon the facility within hours of Chen's demonstration. Fleet admirals, supreme commanders, and strategic coordinators from across the galaxy filled seats that were normally reserved for academic symposiums and graduation ceremonies. Admiral ZYX then stood before the assembled crowd, his 6 eyes scanning faces that represented the combined military might of 47 different species. In 30 years of service, he had never seen so many high-ranking officers in one location outside of a major galactic crisis. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, his voice amplified through the hall's translation systems. "Thank you for responding so quickly to our invitation. What you are about to witness represents a fundamental challenge to military doctrine as we understand it." In the front row, Supreme Admiral Kethare of the Draconian Empire leaned forward in her specially reinforced seat. Her scaled hide bore the ritual markings of someone who had personally commanded fleets in over 200 engagements. "Admiral, we've all read the preliminary reports. One human soldier defeated your security systems through what appears to be structured chaos. Impressive, certainly, but hardly worthy of this level of attention." Fleet Admiral Torquan, who had positioned himself near the central display system, rumbled with what might have been laughter. "Supreme Admiral, with respect, you've read reports about what happened. You haven't understood what happened." The lights dimmed as the holographic display system activated, filling the center of the conference hall with a three-dimensional tactical overview of the previous day's events. The assembled officers watched Chen's progress through the institute with the analytical attention of professionals studying a new form of warfare. Observe the timing, Turquan continued, highlighting specific moments in the tactical display. Sergeant Chen's initial movements appear random, but notice how each action creates cascading effects throughout the facility's defensive systems. Admiral Velkon of the Regelian Strategic Command gestured with one of his forearms. Cascade effects are standard tactical doctrine. Any competent officer learns to exploit system interdependencies. True, agreed Turquan. But observe the scale of the cascades he's creating. The holographic display zoomed in on a specific sequence where Chun had breached a maintenance panel in Section 7. What had appeared to be a simple forced entry revealed itself to be something far more sophisticated when viewed in context. This action severed 3 separate communication networks, triggered emergency protocols in 2 unrelated systems, and created a power fluctuation that temporarily disabled sensor coverage in Section 9. He achieved system-wide disruption through a single point of entry that our defensive planners had classified as non-critical. Grand Marshal Thorax of the Insectoid Collective clicked his mandibles in rapid calculation. Impressive tactical awareness, but still within the parameters of advanced reconnaissance training. Many of our Special Forces units could achieve similar results. Chen's voice echoed through the conference hall from speakers that hadn't been there moments before. Could they, Marshal? Let's find out. The assembled officers turned as one toward the source of the voice, but Chun was nowhere to be seen. The holographic display shifted to show real-time feeds from the conference hall itself, viewed from security cameras that were supposedly monitoring the gathering. Sergeant, Admiral ZYX then said slowly, "When did you arrive?" "I've been here for approximately 20 minutes, Admiral. I accessed the facility through the main ventilation system, established observation posts in 3 different locations, and completed a preliminary assessment of defensive capabilities." Supreme Admiral Kethare stood abruptly, her massive form dominating the front of the hall. "This is supposed to be a secure facility. How did one human penetrate our perimeter?" "The same way I penetrated your perimeter yesterday, Admiral. By operating outside the parameters that your security systems are designed to detect." The holographic display showed Chen's route into the conference hall, a path that had taken him through areas of the facility that weren't even supposed to exist. Access tunnels that had been sealed during construction, abandoned maintenance shafts that had been forgotten by the facility's planners, and structural spaces that existed only because of architectural requirements rather than functional design. Most species design their security systems to detect threats that behave like military units, Chen explained as the display tracked his movements. You scan for organized groups, standard equipment signatures, and movement patterns that conform to known tactical doctrines. Humans have learned to exploit the gaps between what security systems expect to find and what actually exists in the real world. Fleet Admiral Turquan activated his personal communicator. Security Chief Vextar, report status of all perimeter sensors. The reply came back immediately. All systems showing green, sir. No unauthorized personnel detected anywhere in the facility. Chief, there's a human in the conference hall who's been here for 20 minutes. A long pause followed this statement. Sir, that's impossible. I'm looking at the sensor logs right now. There's been no security breach. Chen's laughter echoed through the hall. Chief Vextar is absolutely correct. There has been no security breach because I haven't done anything that your systems define as a breach. I'm currently wearing borrowed maintenance credentials that I acquired from an automated dispensary, following routes that are technically classified as public access, and carrying equipment that registers as standard facility maintenance tools. Admiral ZYX then's mandibles clicked rapidly. Show yourself, Sergeant. Which one, Admiral? The question sent a ripple of confusion through the assembled officers. The holographic display shifted to show multiple views of the conference hall from different angles, and, suddenly, Chun was visible in 3 separate locations simultaneously. What you're observing is the 5th principle of human tactical doctrine, multiplicity of presence. Most species assume that individuals exist in single locations at specific times. Humans have learned to exist in multiple tactical contexts simultaneously through the strategic use of misdirection, proxy presence, and parallel probability planning. One of the Chins, apparently the real one, stepped out from behind a structural support pillar where he had been completely invisible moments before. The other two figures revealed themselves to be sophisticated holographic projections that had been generating false sensor readings throughout the demonstration. Grand Marshal Thorax's mandibles clicked in what might have been applause. Clever, but ultimately a parlor trick. Battlefield conditions would make such elaborate deceptions impossible to maintain. Would they, Marshal? Let's test that theory. The lights in the conference hall suddenly died, plunging the space into complete darkness. Emergency lighting failed to activate, leaving hundreds of military leaders in a situation that violated every security protocol in their respective command manuals. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished non-binary entities, Chin's voice came from speakers throughout the hall. Welcome to what humans call a teaching moment. In the darkness, the assembled officers could hear movement, footsteps, mechanical sounds, and the subtle hum of equipment being activated. The darkness was complete, disorienting even to species with enhanced visual capabilities. Right now, many of you are reaching for personal communicators to contact security forces. You'll find that all electronic devices in this hall have been temporarily disabled by a localized electromagnetic pulse generator. Nothing permanent, just enough to create tactical isolation. Supreme Admiral Ketharay's voice boomed through the darkness. This is an act of war, human. Nothing dangerous, but enough to demonstrate how humans use environmental manipulation as a tactical tool. Species that evolved in controlled environments tend to become disoriented when their surroundings stop behaving predictably. Admiral Zawayekstan's voice carried a note of professional curiosity despite the circumstances. Sergeant, how many different ways are you prepared to demonstrate human tactical superiority? Admiral, that's exactly the wrong question. Human tactical doctrine isn't about superiority, it's about adaptability. We don't win because we're better soldiers. We win because we're willing to stop being soldiers when the situation requires something else. Emergency lighting finally flickered on, revealing that the conference hall had been completely transformed during the minutes of darkness. What had been a formal meeting space was now something that resembled a military training facility, complete with obstacles, defensive positions, and what appeared to be a fully functional command center that Chun had constructed from materials that had been present in the hall all along. The sixth principle of human tactics is environmental fluidity. Most species treat their surroundings as static elements to be worked around. Humans treat their surroundings as raw materials to be reconfigured according to immediate tactical requirements. The assembled officers stared in stunned silence at what Chun had accomplished in complete darkness, while surrounded by hundreds of potential witnesses. The transformation was so complete that several of them began checking their personal navigation systems to confirm they were still in the same room. Fleet Admiral Torquan stood slowly, his ancient eyes gleaming with something that might have been recognition. Sergeant Chun, how long have your people been preparing for war with the rest of the galaxy? The question sent a chill through the assembled officers. The implications of what they had witnessed were beginning to crystallize into something that could reshape galactic politics. Chin's response was immediate and decisive. Sir, with respect, you're still asking the wrong question. Humans aren't preparing for war with the galaxy. We're preparing to protect it. From what? From things that think like we do, but without the limitations that make us predictable. The holographic display activated again, showing star charts that extended far beyond the borders of known space. Red markers indicated contact events that most of the assembled officers had never seen before, incidents that had been classified at levels that restricted access to only the highest echelons of galactic command. 3 years ago, long-range reconnaissance detected signals from the galactic rim that suggest the existence of hostile forces using tactical doctrines similar to human adaptive chaos theory. The difference is that these forces don't appear to have the psychological constraints that keep humans from implementing total warfare. Supreme Admiral Ketharay leaned forward, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern. What kind of constraints? The kind that prevent us from treating civilian populations as legitimate military targets. The kind that limit our use of planet-killing weapons to absolute last resorts. The kind that make us try to find diplomatic solutions even when we know war is inevitable. Chen gestured to the transformed conference hall around them. Everything I've demonstrated here represents human military capabilities operating under peacetime constraints. We follow rules of engagement. We respect civilian spaces. We limit our actions to non-lethal force levels. And we explain our methods to potential allies. The implications of this statement began to sink in among the assembled officers. What they had witnessed wasn't humanity showing off. It was humanity operating under restrictions that their potential enemies might not share. Admiral Torquan asked how long we've been preparing for war. Chen continued. The answer is that we've been preparing for peace. Human tactical doctrine is designed to end conflicts as quickly as possible with minimal casualties on all sides. But if we face an enemy that shares our adaptive capabilities without our ethical limitations. He left the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was clear to every military mind in the hall. Sergeant, Admiral ZYX then said quietly, are you suggesting that humanity has been holding back? Chen's smile returned, but this time it carried no warmth at all. Admiral, what I've shown you represents approximately 15% of human military capability operating under full diplomatic restrictions in a friendly educational environment. Would you like to see what the other 85% looks like? The silence that followed Chen's question stretched across the conference hall like a gravitational field, bending every thought and conversation toward its implications. Hundreds of the galaxy's finest military minds sat in the transformed space, suddenly aware that their understanding of humanity's role in galactic politics had been fundamentally incomplete. Fleet Admiral Torquan was the first to break the silence, his ancient Saurian voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Sergeant Chen, in my 4 centuries of military service, I have learned that the most dangerous question a warrior can ask is whether he has truly seen his enemy's full strength. Are you telling us that humanity has been concealing its true military capabilities? Chen walked slowly to the center of the conference hall, his movements deliberate and measured. The improvised command center he had constructed during the blackout hummed softly around him, its displays showing star charts and tactical projections that extended far beyond the comfortable boundaries of known space. Admiral, humanity hasn't been concealing anything. We've been learning. There's a difference. He activated the central holographic display, filling the space above the assembled officers with a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy. Blue zones indicated regions under the protection of various galactic powers, while green areas marked neutral space. At the edges of the display, red markers pulsed with ominous regularity. 4 years ago, Human Colonial Command detected these signals from the galactic rim. Initial analysis suggested they were natural phenomena, solar flares, gravitational anomalies, the kind of background noise that long-range sensors pick up constantly. The display zoomed in on the red markers, revealing patterns that made several officers sit up straighter in their seats. It took our xenoarchaeology teams 6 months to recognize what they were actually looking at. These aren't natural phenomena. They're weapon signatures. Specifically, they're weapon signatures using technology that operates on principles similar to human adaptive chaos theory, but implemented on a scale that makes our largest military operations look like training exercises. Supreme Admiral Kethare of the Draconian Empire stood abruptly, her scaled hide reflecting the red warning lights of the display. That's impossible. Human military doctrine only developed within the last century. How could an unknown civilization have independently developed similar capabilities? Chen's expression became grim. Admiral, that's exactly the wrong conclusion to draw from this data. Human military doctrine didn't develop independently. It evolved as a response to specific environmental pressures that most galactic species never faced. The holographic display shifted to show historical data from humanity's homeworld, Earth. Battle sites, conflict zones, and war-torn regions covered the planet's surface in a pattern that made the assembled officers exchange concerned glances. Humans evolved on a world where survival required constant adaptation to changing threats. Every continent, every climate zone, every ecosystem produced challenges that couldn't be overcome through static defensive strategies. We learned adaptive chaos theory because our environment taught us that the only constant is change. Grand Marshal Thorax clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. And You believe these RIM signals indicate contact with another species that faced similar evolutionary pressures? Worse, we believe they indicate contact with a species that faced those pressures and responded by eliminating them entirely. The display changed again, showing tactical projections based on the RIM signals. What the assembled officers saw was their worst nightmare made manifest. A civilization that possessed human adaptability, without human limitations, operating on a scale that suggested they had solved the resource constraints that kept most species from implementing total warfare. Admiral ZYX then's 6 eyes focused on different aspects of the display as he processed the implications. Sergeant, if these projections are accurate, then this unknown civilization possesses the ability to project force across galactic distances while maintaining the tactical flexibility that has made human forces so effective. The combination would be unstoppable, Chen finished. Which brings us to why humanity has been holding back, as you put it. We haven't been concealing our capabilities. We've been developing them specifically to counter this threat. The improvised command center around Chun activated fully, revealing the true scope of what he had constructed during the conference hall blackout. What had appeared to be a simple demonstration setup was actually a functioning strategic command facility capable of coordinating military operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. The tactical doctrines I've demonstrated here represent humanity's peacetime military capabilities. They're designed to achieve objectives while minimizing casualties and maintaining diplomatic relationships with allied species. But the RIM threat requires something else entirely. He touched a series of controls, and the holographic display exploded into a complex tactical overview that made every officer in the hall lean forward despite themselves. This is Operation Prometheus, humanity's strategic response to the RIM threat. This level of military coordination would require resources that exceed the combined capacity of every known galactic power. It would, Chen agreed, if we were trying to implement it using conventional resource allocation methods. But human military doctrine doesn't rely on conventional methods. The display zoomed in on specific elements of Operation Prometheus, revealing details that made the assembled officers realize they were looking at something that redefined what was possible in terms of military organization. Human forces operate on the principle of exponential force multiplication through environmental integration. Instead of bringing resources to the battlefield, we turn the battlefield into a resource generation facility. Instead of maintaining supply lines, we establish supply networks that become self-sustaining and adaptive. Supreme Admiral Kethare studied the tactical projections with the intensity of someone trying to find flaws in an otherwise perfect system. Sergeant, what you're describing sounds like the ability to wage war without the economic constraints that limit every other galactic power. If humanity possesses these capabilities, why share them with us? Chen's response was immediate and decisive. Because the RIM threat isn't something humanity can face alone, Admiral. And, more importantly, because defeating it will require every species in the galaxy to understand that survival requires adaptation. He gestured to the assembled officers around him. Everyone in this hall represents a civilization that achieved galactic status through different evolutionary paths. The Draconians mastered force projection, the Altarians perfected tactical coordination, the Insectoids developed swarm intelligence, and dozens of other species contributed unique advantages to the galactic community. The holographic display shifted to show how Operation Prometheus incorporated tactical elements from every major galactic power, creating hybrid strategies that combined the best aspects of different military traditions with human adaptive capabilities. The RIM threat succeeded because it faced opponents who relied on static defensive strategies. Civilizations that built perfect defenses, implemented flawless logistics, and created unbreachable strategic positions, all of which became useless when faced with an enemy that could adapt faster than their decision-making systems could respond. Admiral ZYX then's mandibles clicked as he began to understand the full implications of what Chun was explaining. You're not just offering to teach us human tactics. You're proposing to fundamentally restructure galactic military doctrine. I'm proposing that we evolve, Admiral. The galaxy faces a threat that requires every species to abandon the military traditions that brought them to power and learned to operate in ways that their evolution never prepared them for. Grand Marshal Thorax leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic displays around him. And if we refuse? Chin's expression became completely serious. Then, in approximately 18 months, when the Rim forces reach the outer colonies, you'll discover that all your perfect strategies, all your flawless logistics, and all your unbreachable defenses were designed to fight enemies that follow the same rules you do. The conference hall fell silent as the assembled officers contemplated this possibility. The tactical displays continued to show the scope of Operation Prometheus, a military doctrine that represented humanity's commitment to protecting a galaxy that had never fully trusted them. Fleet Admiral Torquan activated his personal communicator. This is Fleet Admiral Torquan to all commands. Immediate priority Alpha. All strategic planning sessions are suspended pending implementation of new tactical protocols. Authorization, Prometheus. The response was immediate as similar communications began occurring throughout the hall. Decades of military tradition were being set aside in favor of survival strategies that none of them had imagined possible. Chun deactivated the improvised command center, and the conference hall began to transform back to its original configuration. The demonstration was over, but its implications would reshape galactic civilization for generations to come. Sergeant, Admiral ZYX then said as the assembly prepared to disperse. How long do we have to learn these new tactics? Admiral, that depends on how quickly your people can stop thinking like civilized beings and start thinking like survivors. Chun gathered his equipment with the same methodical care he had shown throughout his time at the Institute. Classes begin tomorrow at 0800 hours. Attendance is mandatory for all command-level personnel. We have a galaxy to save, and not much time to figure out how. As the officers filed out of the hall, many of them were already composing communications to their home governments. Humanity's demonstration at the Institute had accomplished something that centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. It had united the galaxy's military forces under a common purpose. The irony was not lost on Chun as he watched them leave. Humanity had spent decades trying to earn the respect and trust of galactic civilization through peaceful cooperation. In the end, they had achieved it by demonstrating that they were the most dangerous species in known space, and that this might be exactly what the galaxy needed to survive. Outside the Institute, transport shuttles were already arriving to carry the assembled officers back to their respective commands. Each one carried with them the knowledge that the galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could fully predict. In the quiet of the empty conference hall, Chen allowed himself a moment to consider the magnitude of what humanity had just committed to. They had revealed their true capabilities to potential allies who might become enemies, shared tactical secrets that could be used against them, and accepted responsibility for training forces that might one day be turned against human interests. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of strategically questionable decision that exemplified human military doctrine. And, like most human tactical decisions, it was probably going to work precisely because it was too crazy for anyone to predict. Chen smiled as he headed for the exit. Tomorrow's classes were going to be very interesting indeed.